I don't think he was. This is the guy.
Good evening. Let's start with the next Silver Jubilee lecture by Professor John Harris. He had been allotted 40 minutes or 45 minutes. It's been cut down to 30. So in the interest of giving him more time, I'll just...
Say anything about me.
I'm going to say a little bit till you walk up there. I'll just say that Professor Harris has a long history of research on the economy, politics, and society of India. His work in Tamil Nadu is particularly well known, and he has a deep interest in issues of agrarian change, sociology of labor markets, and the politics of business. Over to Professor Harris.
Thanks very much indeed. I'd also like to thank Fraser and PP and am I not heard? Can I just speak more loudly, or do I press these buttons or something like that? Okay. I'm sorry to. I feel after that wonderful presentation by Deepanka that I feel so sort of humble. And have to speak from a little text here. But first off, as I said, I'd like to thank Shiva and PP and ADRI for the opportunity of being at this really remarkable conference. And to begin with, my remarks will range quite a long way away from the themes of the conference. But if you'll bear with me, I will return to these themes. We'll return to India and to Bihar and to Jharkhand before the end. And in some ways, what I want to say follows a little bit from some of the things that Jan Bremen was saying yesterday morning, and certainly with his references to the work and ideas of Karl Polanyi. History, of course, doesn't repeat itself, but for some of us, the Trump phenomenon in the United States, the mounting influence of right-wing political movements, such as the Front National in France or Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, the success of political strongmen elsewhere in the world, Erdogan in Turkey, Abe in Japan, or Modi here in India, have awful echoes of the 1930s. These political movements and the parties led by strongmen I've mentioned don't all share exactly the same agenda. They're not all advocates of the protectionism that's promised by Trump and by Marine Le Pen, but all of them do espouse forms of nativist nationalism. They're all explicitly or implicitly critical of existing politics, and they call democracy into question, all the while promising to bring about radical change, supposedly in the interests of the common man, who is, of course, a native. I rather see the trends of recent history in the way that Karl Polanyi did in his book, The Great Transformation, The Political and Economic Origins of Our Times, first published in 1944. Polanyi, of course, was a refugee from Nazism, first in England and later in the United States, and he wrote The Great Transformation in order to develop an explanation for the rise of fascism and for the world crisis of the mid-20th century. Writing of the 1930s, he says, A country approaching the fascist phase showed symptoms among which the existence of a fascist movement proper was not necessarily one. At least as important signs were the spread of irrationalistic philosophies, racialist aesthetics, anti-capitalist demagogy, criticism of the party system, widespread disparagement of the regime or whatever was the name given to the existing democratic setup. It's surely not out of the way to suggest that all these signs are there in President Trump's pronouncements or in those of Marine Le Pen, and several of them, at least, are characteristic of the current regime here in India. Through this lecture, I want to elaborate upon the continuing relevance of Polanyi's analysis to the understanding of the political and economic origins of our times. Then I intend not actually to develop an analysis of current right-wing populist politics, but rather to ask questions about the prospects for a progressive alternative to them. I have absolutely no doubt that the arguments that I want to develop will seem utopian pie in the sky, to some of you at least. But as I've said in my little abstract, it's too easy to be pessimistic about the current state of public affairs across the world. Optimism is hard because we risk disappointment. But we have to first imagine a different state of affairs if we are to avert the prospect of further social disintegration and of the return of authoritarian rule. We live in times of acute insecurity, insecurity that is in many ways deliberately manufactured under neoliberalism. Insecurity promotes anxiety, and as Erich Fromm said many years ago, a reaction to acute and chronic anxiety is submission to and dependence upon authority. How might positive changes be brought about to avert this possibility? Polanyi's argument about the political and economic origins of our times is, of course, that the failed attempts in the 19th century, and again in the aftermath of World War I, to run economies according to the principles of economic liberalism and to establish a self-regulating market economy gave rise to what he called disruptive strains of protectionism and nationalism that ultimately brought about the world crisis of the 1930s and 1940s. The attempt to make a reality of what Polanyi argues is the utopian idea of a self-regulating market economy means that three factors of production, must be treated as commodities so that they can be subject to the laws of the market. Labor, land, and money. Yet, Polanyi argues, they can only ever be fictitious commodities. Labor is just human activity. Land, a shorthand for the natural environment, is given to us rather than being created for sale on the market. While money is a token of value that facilitates exchange. If there's to be a self-regulating market, all of these elements of the economy have to be commodified. But Polanyi argued, these moves to establish the self-regulating market gave rise to a counter-movement as people resisted the treatment of their capacity for work as a commodity, ultimately through unionization and political pressure for legislation to protect workers, as others, landowners and capitalist farmers and peasants, sought to protect land and domestic agriculture, and eventually as governments intervened increasingly to protect business from the effects of the operation of the gold standard, which tends to bring about deflationary pressures. States had to intervene in response to the counter-movement, upsetting the entire premise of the self-regulating market. Already in the last quarter of the 19th century, the self-regulating market was being undone by labor legislation and by protectionism as states sought to protect agriculture and domestic industry and to protect their national currencies. Protectionism was associated with a surge of nationalism leading ultimately to the rise of fascism and to the world crisis of the mid-20th century. Now, when The Great Transformation was published in 1944, Polanyi thought that the era of the market economy had passed, and that this could be, I quote him, the beginning of an era of unprecedented freedom, when regulation and control can achieve freedom not only for the few, but for all. These statements and others in the final chapter of the book, I note in passing, anticipate some of Amartya Sen's arguments, for example, in Development as Freedom. And indeed, the settlement reached at Bretton Woods, also in 1944, did bring about in the West an era of unprecedented freedom for people of my generation. How lucky we were. Many of us enjoyed positive freedoms to adequate nutrition, to good health and sound education that had been unknown to our parents, thanks to the establishment of a welfare state in the context of what has been called embedded liberalism. The Bretton Woods settlement established a market economy that was embedded, or in other words, made subject to social needs by means of regulation and control. There was a general acceptance that the state should focus on full employment, economic growth, and the welfare of its citizens. But as David Harvey relates in his brief history of neoliberalism, what has sometimes been described as a golden age in the advanced capitalist economies, with high rates of economic growth and of redistribution between the late 1940s and the later 1960s, came to an end in the 1970s with lower growth rates, increasing unemployment, and high rates of inflation, what was known at the time as stagflation. Soaring levels of inflation meant, of course, that the control of wealth by the top 1% in the United States especially, and elsewhere in the West, plunged as asset values collapsed. Strong trade unions, once seen by Keynesians as a means of putting more money into workers' pockets and thereby stimulating demand, were now regarded as a major cause of inflation. Efforts to solve the crisis by conventional Keynesian means, public spending and borrowing, drove inflation higher. This was the juncture at which neoliberalism became ascendant. It has meant the renewal of the attempt to establish the self-regulating market economy. The neoliberal paradigm established the combating of inflation as the overarching goal of macroeconomic policy, regardless of what it meant for unemployment and for social relationships. In other words, it brought the disembedding of the economy once again. For market signaling to work, money has to be relied upon to hold its value, and the task of this is supposed to be realized by the gold standard, though there are still those who advocate its restoration. The task is now entrusted to central banks run by technocrats who are presumed to be outside politics. But outside politics or not, neoliberal theories suited a particular ideological agenda. Inflation harms those who are in possession of money and benefits those who owe it. So clamping down on inflation had the effect of reasserting the sovereignty of finance capital. Neoliberalism is, exactly as Harvey argues, a project to restore the class power of holders of wealth, and as Thomas Piketty so famously shows, it has succeeded very well in achieving this. Inflation was overcome in the 1980s, but at the expense of a great deal of the industry of the old centres in North America and Western Europe, from which most have never recovered. This process was assisted by the development of the new International Division of Labour, in which so much manufacturing industry shifted into the erstwhile Third World, where wages were lower and regulation less constraining. The consequence of these trends, combined with the effects of technological change and of change in industrial organisation, has been that the power of organised labour has everywhere been greatly reduced, and the conditions of work are everywhere characterised by high levels of insecurity. Protection for labour, long sought by unions, is almost everywhere weakened in the name of labour market flexibility, which means the recommodification of labour. At the same time, economies have been subject to recurrent crises in a way that was not true of the era of embedded liberalism, substantially because of the treatment of money as a commodity, even if in virtual forms rather than in that of precious metal. Latterly, however, because of the sanctity of the value of money, since about 2010 in Europe and in some other countries too, there's been a strong commitment to austerity. Policies framed by the interesting idea that it's possible for an economically stagnant country to cut its way to prosperity. As Mark Blythe has shown, the historical record demonstrates that this idea is a delusion. Yet, of course, austerity causes further suffering to the most vulnerable. So that's money as a commodity. Land as real estate is one of the most significant assets in the portfolios of many of the wealthiest people in the world, and there's extensive financialization of housing, housing disconnected from its social function but made into a commodity. Many cities, including, of course, Indian cities, have seen the construction of swathes of hyper-expensive real estate, often in what are described as regenerated neighborhoods. A very clear reflection of a society that doesn't care about the most vulnerable. This is the consequence, too, of the shift to the privatization of services encouraged under neoliberalism. The discourse on privatization involves a shift from the public realm of individuals as citizens to a private realm view of them as consumers. Notions of active citizenship and the public interest have to be transformed to those of an enterprise culture where the consumer reigns supreme and in which the state chooses to ignore social class and inequality, assuming that where a need exists, there are consumers who are able to pay for it. It amounts to the manufacturing of insecurity. In sum, the era of neoliberalism over the last 35 years and more is a third phase of market fundamentalism that has seen the emergence of new and wild forms of the commodification of money as a tool of profit-making, the recommodification of labour, and the destructive decommodification of labour as well, as labour is pushed into insecure, informal activity, and the ever-deepening commodification of nature, of which Vinita Damodaran spoke this morning. So now my question is, can we discern any trends that are comparable with those that Polanyi observed in the 19th and early 20th century episodes of market fundamentalism? Neoliberalism and the development of global capitalism have hugely restricted, it seems to me, the political space. We are all more or less neoliberal now. There's been so little to choose in terms of economic policy between Congress-led and BJP-led coalitions in this country. Little to choose between Conservative governments and Labour governments in the United Kingdom. And reaction against democracy that offers no real alternatives is one of the forces that has driven the wave of protest movements of the last decade. There have been protest movements in at least 70 countries since the financial crisis of 2008, of which only one of the most striking was the Occupy movement that started with the occupation of Wall Street, but spread to 30 different countries, standing, as the banners said, for the 99%, those whom we now recognize as accounting for less than 50% of the world's wealth. Then there was the Take the Square movement in Madrid in 2011 that spread across Spain and Portugal. The June Days of Brazil in 2013, in which protesters demanded FIFA standard hospitals, which of course at the time when all the stadia were being built for the World Cup and so on. There have been significant differences between these various protest movements in terms of the issues around which mobilization has taken place and of the demands they've raised. What they've shared has been a sense of moral indignation and mistrust of political elites, sometimes focused, as in India with the Hazare movement, on political corruption. Their context, and in some way or other the trigger for them, has been the sense of precariousness and insecurity. They've generally been characterized by spontaneity and non-violence, and youth have played a major part in them. But they have been, in the words of the sociologist Asif Bayat, movements of revolution, not revolution. Movements which have drawn strength from appealing to a wide range of people, but which have generally lacked coherent agendas, Occupy being a partial exception, beyond that of looking for the reform of existing political regimes. And there's an important sense in which protest has come to be seen as an alternative to electoral politics, as we saw in India in the split between Hazare and Kejriwal, as continues to be a divisive issue among the supporters of Podemos in Spain, and as divides the Labour Party now in the United Kingdom. So there is a counter-movement, I'm saying, but it's an inchoate one. And it's this mood that the right-wing populists to whom I referred at the start of this talk have tapped into. They, like the strong men elsewhere in the world, including here in India, promise to bring about change in the existing political regime, and in the words that were so powerful, it seems, in influencing the Brexit vote in my native country, to take back control. This is what Trump promises, isn't it? To take back control in the interests of the white Americans who are a majority oppressed by concessions made to migrants and minorities, a bit like Hindus in India, according to the ideology of the Sangh Parivar. Polanyi thought that fascism was one response to the crisis of the 1930s. It was one way, in his terms, of re-embedding the economy in society, albeit in a way that sacrificed democracy. And that's what Trump seems implicitly to offer now to his core supporters in the United States. Trust me, he says, and I'll bring back the jobs by rejecting existing trade agreements, by leaning on big companies, and I'll make America great again. Back to the future, back to the 1950s when blacks and women knew their place. But there was another response in the 1930s to the crisis brought about by the collapse of the self-regulating market that economic liberals had sought to establish. This was the New Deal in the United States. And this had quite a lot in common with another response that Polanyi didn't write about, which was the rise of social democracy in Scandinavia. Is there any possibility now for any sort of a social democratic alternative? Clearly, the prospects for social democracy aren't good. The most successful social democratic movement, which took place in Scandinavia, in Denmark, in Sweden and Norway, was built around a broad-based political movement in which the organized working class played an important role, ultimately entering into a pact with capital and taking farmers in too. Hard to see how such a movement will happen again in the context of the patterns of economic development that have now taken hold and that have so greatly reduced the power of organized labor. How now might it be possible for political collectivities to form that can take on, in some sense, the role that organized labor sustained in the middle and later 20th century? Work that I've been engaged in over several years with Scandinavian and Indian colleagues, including Pranab Bardhan and Neera Chandok and N.C. Saxena, orchestrated by Ole Törnqvist of the University of Oslo, has led us to think that the best prospects, perhaps, for the formation of such political collectivities may come about through a reversal of the sequence of development in Scandinavia. There, the achievement of economic and social rights followed from the mobilization of that broad-based political movement. Now we think in countries like India and Brazil and Indonesia, perhaps South Africa, it may be the struggle for the realization of economic and social rights, for rights to health and education, to a livelihood, to food and decent housing that can make it possible for people from disparate social groups to find common cause in placing programmatic demands upon the state. We might take heart from the fact that a common refrain in many of the protest movements to which I've referred was, "We want better public services." The struggle has to be for the establishment of the rights of all people as citizens, entitled to impartial governance and fair public services, rather than for targeted interventions that have, of course, the character of charity for the poor. A condition for the realization of this potential is a degree of disengagement from the vortex of global capitalism. What's required is not a retreat into autarky or rigid protectionism, but rather some regulation of trade and of movements of capital in such a way, if you will, as to bring society back into the equation. An example of what is needed is the trade deal negotiated by China with South Africa on the basis of the social impact trade had on employment, which led to the setting of a quota on the import of clothing and textile products from China. The struggle stands to be advanced by the development of social movement unionism, in which unions engage more directly in the public arena and form coalitions with other civil society actors, recognizing that the commoditization of society and the environment affects all strata of society. Labour organization is, of course, under enormous pressure. But, there's a sting there, I think, that the context of the increasing precariousness of employment produces greater incentives now for higher wage employees to find common cause with contract employees and informal workers. There are some signs in India of this kind of development taking place. The Secretary General of the CITU said recently that more than 60% of the members of unions affiliated with the centre are informally employed. And union action, as in the general strikes that have been called by all the major trade union federations, Indian trade union federations, working together in the recent past, is to make demands upon the state for social rights and for fair public services. A social floor of minimum income and social security benefits, such as the federations now struggle for, would have the effect of empowering informal workers, bringing about some levelling up of the living standards of all working people, increasing their market-based bargaining power. What I'm suggesting is that mobilization around demands for social rights maybe supplies a better base for broad unity than the workplace issues that have been always the focus of union activity in the past. And social movement unionism can also be the basis of an active democratic society, taking participation beyond the limitations of representative democracy. I've been asked quite often in recent months about where, if at all, there are grounds for hope for a better future for the people of India. There are grounds for hope, I believe, in what has been described as India's new rights agenda. With the passage of the Right to Information Act in 2005, then with NAREGA, the Forest Rights Act, the Right to Education, and the National Food Security Act, which provide for justiciable rights to food, livelihood, and education. What is so sorely lacking is a comparable right to basic health care. And of course, the passage of all this legislation, following from the actions of some notable policy entrepreneurs, both inside and outside government, from lobbying by civil society activists, and from judicial intervention, does not of itself guarantee that rights are delivered. The evidence is, of course, that the Forest Rights Act has so far been very, very poorly implemented. The failures of the public education system have been made all too plain in the regular assessments of standards each year by the ASER, and in the sharp increase in enrollments in private schools even since the passing of the RTE. There's a grave danger that failures of implementation will further damage the credibility of governments. But the legislation does set up some points of leverage and can encourage mobilizations for the realization of social and economic rights. And not only does the legislation promise social rights, but it also embraces a kind of governance reform. A distinctive feature of this new welfare paradigm in India concerns its efforts to promote greater political transparency, responsiveness, and accountability by means of institutional mechanisms whereby ordinary people and their associations can demand greater accountability of government. This is the significance of the Right to Information Act in the context of the new rights framework. And there are transparency clauses in other parts of the new legislation encouraging the mobilization of people to hold the state to account and to claim their rights as citizens, as, for example, through the social audits that are legislated for in NREGA. A social audit is a public process of reviewing official records and of establishing whether or not there's a correspondence between what is reported and what has actually happened. The Food Security Act, too, legislates for social audits of the functioning of ration shops. Such auditing, as pretty well everybody here knows, I guess, was pioneered in Rajasthan by the MKSS using the instrument of a Jan Sunwai. The fact that in Rajasthan the conduct of these events should have been so vigorously resisted by local officials is a testament to how powerful a vehicle of accountability they can be. Of course, that resistance has at the moment been successful in blocking social auditing of NREGA in Rajasthan, and only in Andhra Pradesh have social audits been at all regularly conducted. But the principle of citizen participation is an important one, and it's reflected, for instance, in the provisions that are made in the new Land Acquisition Act for involving and securing the consent of those affected. And I was interested, very interested, to hear from Jeff Witso in a conversation yesterday that the Grievance Redressal Act here in Bihar, seems to have some force. It's from his observations of action being brought under the Grievance Redressal Act. The establishment of such mechanisms that encourage greater participation in public decision-making actually have the effect of increasing the surface area of the contact between state and society, so making for more substantial democracy in a way that recalls the Scandinavian experience of institutionalized cooperation between state and civil society. Institutions such as that of the social audit and others that are contained within the social rights legislation, such as the requirements set out in the Right to Education Act for the establishment of school management committees. These institutions aren't going to spring into life automatically, but the fact that they're required by law provides a foundation for action on the parts of civil society groups. Of course, there's a long way to go to realize the potentials of the new rights agenda and of the governance reform that it offers. Another condition for the success of social democracy in Scandinavia in the 20th century was the raft of administrative reforms that were put into effect in the later part of the previous century. This country, too, clearly badly needs administrative reforms. Strict regulation of electoral financing and reforming the transfer system in the bureaucracy seem to me to be amongst the crucial reforms that are required if India is to have anything like an effective state in place of one that operates mainly through selective patronage. So there are vastly difficult struggles ahead. But India's new social rights agenda does seem to me to offer some hope for the realization of a progressive response to the troubles of our time, the insecurity and the experience of precariousness that feed the right-wing nativist populism and the tilt to authoritarianism that are increasingly prevalent in these, our times. Thus,
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have had a very insightful analysis, and Professor Harris has left us many things, thoughts to think about. Listening to both Dipankar Gupta and Professor Harris, there is no doubt that the future of India depends to a large extent on how well we assure individual human rights and the extent to which there is an expansion of overall freedoms. But I think the general sense that I got is that this future is increasingly threatened by growing inequalities and growing divisions in society, and in India at least, a new interpretation of justice, where some rights, to a large extent, especially of the poor, can be sacrificed for a national good. And I think that, in a sense, what you see of the demonetization effort to make demonetization a popular move was the spirit. And the current efforts in India are also, I think, to some extent, the efforts to promote policy actions with a new framework of dominant nationalism. I think that's come out that exploits vulnerabilities and inequalities, insecurities. A vision of a new India. I mean, whenever you talk about India 2022 and a promise of a new land and new India, really is a way of articulating that the end of this new wave of dominant nationalism will indeed, you might sacrifice a little bit and feel the pain a little bit now, but it's going to give us a new India. And combined with the revival and resurgence of this narrow Indian identity are really threats to India's future and India's democracy. So I won't say more about this, and I'm sure all of you have lots of questions. We have 10 to 15 minutes of questions, so we'll take a first round of 3 questions and then get a response and do a second round. Dipankar Gupta.
Well, John, it's very impressive. You compressed so many things in one presentation with very little left over. I just have an issue with, you want to bring something to attention, that is the question of rights, and you've used it as a central feature of your presentation. I feel that the language of rights has been overused, and we should now think in terms of policy. In other words, I don't believe we'll go very far if we talk in terms of right to health, right to education, or right to food. Because right to health, right to education, right to food can be met easily by providing substandard stuff. The right has been met, what more do you want? Go to Sufficient Hospital, Patna Hospital, or some silly hospital in Darbhanga, and there you have your right to health. Go to inferior schools, your right to education. Your right to food, for example, doesn't take into account nutrition. So I think the language of right, which is a very UN kind of language, should be, kind of tempered with the right to policy. If you have policies, then what happens is, if something doesn't work, you know whom to catch. If somebody doesn't go to school, who will you put in jail? The father, the mother, the principal, the district magistrate? You don't know. If somebody doesn't get proper treatment in the hospital and lies on the floor and doesn't get a bed, who will you penalize? Which is why I think the language of rights is overdone and actually misses the point, and in my view, should be replaced immediately with the language of policy.
Okay, Deepak Yawali from Nepal, one of the few people who tries to push the Polanyi line there through our immersion course on contemporary issues. John, the litany of measures you identified, reform trade unionism to just about everything, would help bring the market under the control of society, but it still does very little to bring market under the control of nature. Nature continues to be commodified and raped under the kind of system we have. So my question to you is, how would you react to what some of us, me, but more importantly, Tony Allen in King's College, Arjen Hoekstra in the Netherlands, and people like that, have been arguing for this concept of water and energy footprint. The fact that a cup of yogurt in an average European supermarket has orders of magnitude more energy spent in its labeling and marketing and transport and all that than is there in the cup of yogurt, means that we've got to bring back these consumption items through the water and energy footprint into legislation and taxation as a way of decommodifying nature.
Me next? Oh, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
John, thank you very much. It was a great coverage of all the trials and tribulations that we're facing. I worked in international trade union for 20 years, and I saw the decline of organised labour over that period. I was working in public services, which were undermined particularly by the Reagan and Thatcher privatisation years. But the element that I think needs mentioning in all of this is collectivism, because one of the things that trade unions relied upon, and indeed the social democratic movements of the Nordic countries, was a belief that we could do things together, that we can work together, we can build together, and we can sacrifice together and put our resources together. But the movements that have grown up, the protest movements that you mentioned, the Occupy movements and so on, are short-lived, and they don't sustain ideas over a longer period. And I wondered where you saw a new form of collectivism developing, which could sustain the kinds of changes that you would like to see faced by the strength of the neoliberal agenda.
Don't you want to answer this?
Okay. Dipankar, suppose I have to use this one. Okay, all right, yeah. Dipankar, I'm very sympathetic indeed to what you've said, because I do think that the language of rights is sort of overused, and that transparency clauses in other parts of the new legislation, encouraging the mobilization of people to hold the state to account and to claim their rights as citizens, as for example through the social audits that are legislated for in NAREGA. A social audit is a public process of reviewing official records and of establishing whether or not there's a correspondence between what is reported and what has actually happened. The Food Security Act, too, legislates for social audits of the functioning of ration shops. Such auditing, as pretty well everybody here knows, I guess, was pioneered in Rajasthan by the MKSS using the instrument of Ajahn Sunwai. The fact that in Rajasthan the conduct of these events should have been so vigorously resisted by local officials is a testament to how powerful a vehicle of accountability they can be. Of course, that resistance has at the moment been successful in blocking social auditing of NAREGA in Rajasthan, and only in Andhra Pradesh have social audits been at all regularly conducted. But the principle of citizen participation is an important one, and it's reflected, for instance, in the provisions that are made in the new Land Acquisition Act for involving and securing the consent of those affected. And I was very interested to hear from Jeff Witso in a conversation yesterday that the Grievance Redressal Act here in Bihar, seems to have some force. It's from his observations of action being brought under the Grievance Redressal Act. The establishment of such mechanisms that encourage greater participation in public decision-making actually had the effect of increasing the surface area of the contact between state and society, so making for more substantial democracy in a way that recalls the Scandinavian experience of institutionalized cooperation between state and civil society. Institutions such as that of the social audit and others that are contained within the social rights legislation, such as the requirements set out in the Right to Education Act for the establishment of school management committees. These institutions aren't going to spring into life automatically, but the fact that they're required by law provides a foundation for action on the parts of civil society groups. Of course, there's a long way to go to realize the potentials of the new rights agenda and of the governance reform that it offers. Another condition for the success of social democracy in Scandinavia in the 20th century was the raft of administrative reforms that were put into effect in the later part of the previous century. This country too clearly badly needs administrative reforms. Strict regulation of electoral financing and reforming the transfer system in the bureaucracy seem to me to be amongst the crucial reforms that are required if India is to have anything like an effective state in place of one that operates mainly through selective patronage. So there are vastly difficult struggles ahead. But India's new social rights agenda does seem to me to offer some hope for the realization of a progressive response to the troubles of our time, the insecurity and the experience of precariousness that feed the right-wing nativist populism and the tilt to authoritarianism that are increasingly prevalent in these, our times. Thus,
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have had a very insightful analysis, and Professor Harris has left us many things, thoughts to think about. Listening to both Dipankar Gupta and Professor Harris, there is no doubt that the future of India depends to a large extent on how well we assure individual human rights and the extent to which there is an expansion of overall freedoms. But I think the general sense that I got is that this future is increasingly threatened by growing inequalities and growing divisions in society, and in India at least, a new interpretation of justice, where some rights, to a large extent, especially of the poor, can be sacrificed for a national good. And I think that, in a sense, what you see of the demonetization effort to make demonetization a popular move was the spirit. And the current efforts in India are also, I think, to some extent, the efforts to promote policy actions with a new framework of dominant nationalism. I think that's come out that exploits vulnerabilities and inequalities, insecurities. A vision of a new India. I mean, whenever you talk about India 2022 and a promise of a new land and new India, really is a way of articulating that the end of this new wave of dominant nationalism will indeed, you might sacrifice a little bit and feel the pain a little bit now, but it's going to give us a new India. And combined with the revival and resurgence of this narrow Indian identity are really threats to India's future and India's democracy. So I won't say more about this, and I'm sure all of you have lots of questions. We have 10 to 15 minutes of questions, so we'll take a first round of 3 questions and then get a response and do a second round. Dipankar Gupta.
Well, John, it's very impressive. You compressed so many things in one presentation with very little left over. I just have a issue with you want to bring something to attention, and that is the question of rights, and you've used it as a central feature of your presentation. I feel that the language of rights has been overused. and we should now think in terms of policy. In other words, I don't believe we'll go very far if we talk in terms of right to health, right to education, or right to food. Because right to health, right to education, right to food can be met easily by providing substandard stuff. The right has been met, what more do you want? Go to Sufficient Hospital, Patna Hospital, or some silly hospital in Darbhanga, and there you have your right to health. Go to inferior schools, your right to education. Your right to food, for example, doesn't take into account nutrition. So I think the language of right, which is a very UN kind of language, should be, kind of tempered with the right to policy. If you have policies, then what happens is, if something doesn't work, you know whom to catch. If somebody doesn't go to school, who will you put in jail? The father, the mother, the principal, the district magistrate? You don't know. If somebody doesn't get proper treatment in the hospital and lies on the floor and doesn't get a bed, who will you penalize? Which is why I think the language of rights is overdone and actually misses the point, and in my view, should be replaced immediately with the language of policy.
Okay, Deepak Yawali from Nepal, one of the few people who tries to push the Polanyi line there through our immersion course on contemporary issues. John, the litany of measures you identified, reform trade unionism to just about everything, would help bring the market under the control of society, but it still does very little to bring market under the control of nature. Nature continues to be commodified and raped under the kind of system we have. So my question to you is, how would you react to what some of us, me, but more importantly, Tony Allen in King's College, Arjen Hoekstra in the Netherlands, and people like that, have been arguing for this concept of water and energy footprint. The fact that a cup of yogurt in an average European supermarket has orders of magnitude more energy spent in its labeling and marketing and transport and all that than is there in the cup of yogurt, means that we've got to bring back these consumption items through the water and energy footprint into legislation and taxation as a way of decommodifying nature.
Me next? Oh, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
John, thank you very much. It was a great coverage of all the trials and tribulations that we're facing. I worked in international trade union for 20 years, and I saw the decline of organised labour over that period. I was working in public services, which were undermined particularly by the Reagan and Thatcher privatisation years. But the element that I think needs mentioning in all of this is collectivism, because one of the things that trade unions relied upon, and indeed the social democratic movements of the Nordic countries, was a belief that we could do things together, that we can work together, we can build together, and we can sacrifice together and put our resources together. But the movements that have grown up, the protest movements that you mentioned, the Occupy movements and so on, are short-lived, and they don't sustain ideas over a longer period. And I wondered where you saw a new form of collectivism developing, which could sustain the kinds of changes that you would like to see faced by the strength of the neoliberal agenda.
Don't you answer this?
Okay. Dipankar, okay,
All right, yeah.
Dipankar, I'm very sympathetic indeed to what you've said, because I do think that the language of rights is is sort of overused, and that it's become part of a sort of international speak. But I'm certainly not satisfied by the idea that it's better to talk in terms of policy than of rights. That just sort of pushes the problem aside. It seems to me, as I said, I think there is a huge danger in this country in the way in which the language of rights is used in all this new legislation, especially when the state fails to deliver on these rights. It sort of all comes apart, as it were. But I certainly take the point about what on earth does it mean to have, there is a legal right. The child has a legal right to a person has a legal right to those 8 years of education. How is that right really to be made justiciable? Nonetheless, it does seem to me to be, really pretty fundamentally important that education, livelihood, and so on are recognized now as rights, rather than just being, directive principles as they were, which were supposed to be, directions for policy. And it's really because of the points of leverage for organization, to make claims, of the kind that's certainly been happening to some extent in regard to Narega, which that's what seems to me to be important. So I'm very sympathetic to what you say about the problems of that language, but I do think that the fact that these are justiciable it's an important kind of principle. But it's a little bit more than just a direction for policy.
Professor Harris, may I just
make a suggestion?
No. Yeah,
I'm so sorry. Okay.
We need a second round. And we have only 5 minutes left. I do want a second round. So
okay, Deepak. I sort of think that that in the end, actually, it may be around the environment, around water and energy, and of course around the devastating sort of changes that are coming going to come with global warming. I think it may in the end be around those issues that the really powerful counter movement starts to develop. But we ain't there yet. It's got to come. And I was trying to sort of talk through where it seems to me there may be grounds for a new kind of collectivism. And as I say, it seems to me that there are some indications that struggles over the realization of social and economic rights can actually bring people together, across many different groups, really be a basis for mobilization, rather than the protest that doesn't really seem to go anywhere with the protest movements that I was talking about.
Okay, last round. Who's got the mic? Was to make that decide, then gentleman at the back.
Yeah.
Sorry, sir. 3 more questions.
You see, one of the features of the crisis since 2008 has been the total failure of social democracy in Europe to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And the reason is that the trade unions which we used to think powerful no longer represent manufacturing industry, because thanks to neoliberalism, manufacturing has moved to poorer countries. And the poorer countries would never have been richer without neoliberalism. Thank you very much. So, there are paradoxes here. And you can't just wish collective action like that if the collective action involves white-collar workers. Who cares if they go on strike?
No, it's fine. Let's have it.
I would like to back up what John has said, and I beg to disagree with what Deepanker said and Magna just now. The problem of the failure of social democracy is because social democracy surrendered to neoliberalism. That is the origin, not the political ideology in itself. And as far as rights and policies are concerned, the emphasis on rights among social movements nowadays in India is because the policies failed. The rights, the call for rights, came out of the failure of policy, be it Garibi Hataao or the promise of 300 million jobs. We should indeed insist on rights to decent work and rights to dignified livelihood. And that is education, healthcare, housing, and enough to earn, to enjoy.
This is Manish from
The last question, please.
Okay, sir. So now you have touched upon one of the hardest questions of political economy. If there was a Karl Polanyi writing about defending, criticizing self-regulating markets, there was also Karl Popper advocating open markets. Now, in the last 30 years or so, you have seen that neoliberal policies, under neoliberal policies practiced across the globe in most of the countries, especially China and India, we have seen the starkest decline in the number of poor people. So in some way, those policies have held. Even after the global financial crisis of 2008, we continue to believe in them. Maybe the recovery at this moment is not that strong, but still no alternative has emerged. And thirdly, the rise of strong political men, in America or in European countries, how do you see that? Is that a crisis of economics only, or is it also a crisis of democracy or a crisis of globalization? Thank you.
So you're going to come to me as well. Okay, last, very short, one-sentence question.
Well, let's just, Ferguson, who wrote The Politics Machine, has recently wrote a book called Give a Man a Fish. And he tells a story about a big conference, a bit like this, in which everybody's talking about rights to housing, in fact. And the whole day has gone on, and it's been a very nice consensus about rights to housing. And right towards the end of the meeting, an old man at the back, he's been allowed to sit in and participate. He's not wearing very good clothing. He doesn't come from a university. And he stands up and he says, I don't want a right to a house. I want a house. Which of course is Deepanker's point about policy. The other thing I want to say very quickly is that Polanyi, of course, focused upon people pursuing livelihoods through decent, decommodified work protected by the state. But of course, what we're looking at with relocations of labour, globalisation and so on, we're looking at, of course, growth without corresponding employment generation. And that would seem to argue for a shift to the basis of livelihoods to a citizen's right, if you like, rather than an employment right. And perhaps that connects John and Deepanker together.
Sure. Thank you. Maybe you want to react or?
What can I say to Meghna? That, of course I recognize exactly the terrible failures of social democracy in my part of the world, in Europe, in the United Kingdom. What I'm trying to do is to, as I said in answer to the question from, sorry, I don't know your name, person who spoke from experience of the trade union movement over many years, of where there can be the basis for wider political mobilizations of the kind on which can stand in the place of the broad-based political movement that did establish social democracies in the Nordic countries and elsewhere in Europe. And I think that struggles to realize economic and social rights, we're talking about universal rights, and actually bring together, yes, large sections of the middle classes whose conditions of life and living and so on are increasingly precarious as well, together with those of the I'm tempted to say, the erstwhile working class. It's got to be rebuilt on a different basis, clearly. And what I'm looking for is, where is the basis for social democracy? As Jan said, surely the idea, the values which are reflected in social democracy are really worth struggling for. Jeff, thank you. I think I take support from your intervention. I'm really sorry. I wasn't fully able to make, old gentleman hard of hearing or something like that. I couldn't quite make sense of your question, but did I understand you to be saying that India, China continue to pursue sort of neoliberalizing policies, right? Yes, they do. They have to be, struggled against, and I'm sort of talking about where the basis for building an alternative can come from. Looking for something which is not just to say, we need a revolution, abolish capitalism, or whatever. How to go back to Polanyi, how to regulate and control capitalism so that there is more freedom, greater freedom for more people.
Thank you. I'm just going to take a minute to make closing comments. It's been a very fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Harris. I think the issue of rights and policies is a huge debate going on, and I really don't see much of a contradiction, because we need to have rights as the basis on which we formulate policy. These are intermediated by availability of resources, of ensuring that the primary responsibilities of the state, and it also opens up the opportunity for some social contracts in society to achieve what the guaranteed rights are. But we can talk about that later. But I still want to go back and say that the importance of policy should not be undermined just because we have this disconnect between rights and policies. And one of the key tasks at this point of time is, how do you prevent bad policies from being formulated? And here I think at least there are two things that we need in India. You need a strong political opposition, which unfortunately we don't have at this point of time. And you need a very strong civil society or a civil rights movement. India has a very strong tradition of social movements, but at this point of time, the suppression of civil society movements, NGO work, etc., is quite depressing. So there's a little bit of, pessimism, whether the political parties and the countervailing voices provided by civil society movements and organizations can really check bad policies from being formulated. But I want to end on a note of optimism and say that what contributes to good policy formulations, and how can we get good policies, and here is the role of public debate and public discourse, public discussion. And I want to end by saying that we are actually, I think your plea is also to come up with a counter narrative that is appealing to the people, that makes sense of what is happening, deconstructs what is happening, and shows an alternative path to progress and development. And in that, there is the role of the intellectual. It's been quite common for us to blame the failure of politics, the failure of society, the failure of media, the failure of government, the failure of other institutions, etc., etc. But the responsibility of the intellectual at this point of time to really come up with a counter-narrative is extremely vital for the future of India. And I think sitting in a group like this, it's really inspiring, and we can end on an optimistic note that that potential really exists, and that's what we need to harness for the future of India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll move on to the last lecture of the day. This lecture is chaired by Vinita Damodran, Professor at the University of Sussex, Brighton. And this lecture will be delivered by Peter Robb, Emeritus Professor, School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. The topic for this lecture is Colonial Development on Watchmen and Water in Bihar under British Rule. Can I please request the speaker and the chairperson to come on stage?